tomato sauce cans.
That's
It's
cool.
like-
Yeah.
I thought they were soup cans. Same thing.
yeah. My wife
Yeah.
is very crafty and
Andy
has
Warhol
some really cool
influence. You a fan of Andy Warhol?
I don't think he heard you.
Oh,
Michael.
sorry.
You a fan
Yes.
of Andy Warhol?
Yes, of course. I mean, as a native Pittsburgher and someone who values art, of course.
Okay. Here's
Okay,
the.
get started whenever you'd like.
Oh, okay, good.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much. So,
Um,
folks, I am. Oh, sorry, you're introducing me, Dad. I forgot. I feel.
Just give me 1 minute to
Take your time.
develop, okay? I would like to introduce our son, Cantor Michael McCloskey. Michael is a cantor educator at Temple Emeth in Chestnut Hill, a suburb of Boston, where he served since 2007. He has a degree in vocal performance from Duquesne University and a master's in Jewish education and a cantorial ordination from Hebrew College in Boston. Michael is currently enrolled in a Cantors to Rabbis program at the Academy for Jewish Religion in Yonkers, and he will be getting a rabbinical degree from there, hopefully within the next 18 months or so. Michael is also currently the president of the New England region of the Cantors Assembly and also on the Cantors Assembly Executive Council. But more than the academic degrees that Michael's attained, what Michael possesses is something that I have seen very few people possess, and that is an insatiable thirst for learning and knowledge and the willingness and just the overwhelming desire to share it with others so that we can all gain a little more knowledge about certain topics. Shelley and I on Wednesday and or Thursday mornings attend Michael's coffee with the Cantor adult education that we're able to do on Zoom. So with that having been said, here is Cantor Michael McCloskey.
Thank you, Dad. Can I take you on the road with me? That's a very nice introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm humbled and honored to be with you, friends, and with your truly wonderful rabbi as well, who I enjoy learning from when I'm visiting. I want to just say a really brief word before we dig in to this. I've come into a certain expertise with regard to Jewish reparations, or I should say reparations from a Jewish perspective, somewhat randomly, but I am very interested in racial justice. It's one of the things I like to teach about, in addition to environmentalism and other issues that I personally consider to be crucial in our time, and that I feel like Judaism needs to have a response to. I did study with Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein, who wrote the article that's a response to Ta-Nehisi Coates's A Case for Reparations, the Torah Case for Reparations. So again, honored to be with you. I'm going to share just a little bit of video, because I think sometimes a picture or a video, really is very poignant. This is actually from NBC News, South Florida. I thought it would be poignant to kind of think about things from in your own neck of the woods, and just to share just a couple minutes of that just to begin.
Americans get reparations.
By the way, can everybody hear that?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure. Okay.
Reparations to make amends for how our government has treated them for centuries. But how would that work? How much would that cost? Will it happen under a Biden-Harris presidency? To all of those questions, for this story, I'm comfortable saying, I don't know.
Committee on the Judiciary, Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties will come to order. Mr. Coates, thank you for being here, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Yesterday, When asked about reparations, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell offered a familiar reply.
I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for whom none of us currently living are responsible, is a good idea. No one currently alive was responsible for that.
This rebuttal proffers a strange theory of governance, that American accounts are somehow bound by the lifetime of its generations. If I injure you, the injury persists even after I actually commit the act. If I stab you, you may suffer complications long after that initial actual stabbing. That's the case with African Americans. They're people well within the living memory of this country. They're still suffering from the after effects of that.
Thank you very much. I yield.
So folks, I'm just going to stop the share for a second. So just wanted to sort of get us into the material a little bit. Now I'm going to share the actual text that I want to look at with you. I always like to begin my sessions with looking at the arts and media and politics and really sort of to have some sources that sort of bring us into the topic. The title of this is called A Cantor's Case for Reparations, because I personally believe, although I'm not here to convince you of that, I'm here to present the sources and let them speak for themselves, but I personally believe that this is an important mission in our time. So I want to be transparent with you about the way I feel about it. Just a couple things that I will bring to your attention. Excuse me, one second, folks. I think, unfortunately, we're sharing space, and I think my cleaners are here, which is lovely. Who was?
He had to go to his
Cleaners. He thinks.
Michael, could you make that a little bigger, please?
I am going to make it a little bit bigger. So thank you. So I'm back, folks. So there are, a few things. There's a quotation from the Avett Brothers. I'm a wonderful folk group that says, "I am a son of Uncle Sam, and I struggle to understand the good and evil. In a place built on stolen land with stolen people, we are more than the sum of our parts. All these broken homes and broken hearts. God, will you keep us wherever we go? Will you forgive us for where we've been?" America is a place, I believe, that considers that it has a sacred destiny. I think that idea is shared by people on all parts of the political spectrum. And if that is indeed the case, then reparations and the way in which we address them are integral to that narrative. This next quote is from the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Devarim. This is actually included at the very beginning of Ta-Nehisi Coates' magisterial article, A Case for Reparations. It was published in the Atlantic Monthly, and I have a link for it at the very end. I hope that you will read it and consider what you think. This is in reference to an indentured, essentially what was indentured servitude in the ancient Near East. So it says, "And if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold unto thee," in other words, they had considerable debts and they were paying off these debts, and they serve you 6 years, but in the sabbatical year, you shall let them go free. And when you send them free from indentured servitude, you shall not let them go away empty. You shall furnish them out of your flock, i.e. animals, which were a great source of prosperity and wealth and nurturing in the ancient Near East, out of your floor. So that's your granary, in other words, out of your wine press, and of all the things that God has blessed you with. And remember that you are a bondman, that you are a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this thing today. So in other words, folks, this is in regard to indentured servitude. How much more so, if we're going to make that kind of an argument, would it be with regard to a people who are enslaved? This next piece is, and I am, from my perspective, I am glad that this is the case. Since I took this course, which was last summer, much has been achieved and much has changed in regard to the discussion of reparations. And this is from an article about a synagogue in Northampton, Massachusetts, which is where Smith is. It's actually quite close to me. It says, following a long and dedicated history of anti-racism work, Congregation B'nai Israel of Northampton has spent the last 10 months focused closely on studying the social ethics of reparations for Black and Indigenous communities. And moreover, the board unanimously decided to adopt a resolution in support of the community taking tangible steps. So this was published on 7/1/2021, and this is, I think, the very beginning of this conversation in the Jewish community. I think you are going to see many more synagogues as we are seeing churches wrestling with this concept of reparations. And then finally, I won't read this to you, but this is the quote by Senator Mitch McConnell that we heard in the video, essentially saying that reparations for something that happened 150 years ago are not relevant. We've elected a Black president, according to Senator McConnell, and the Civil War resolved the original sin of slavery by passing landmark civil rights legislation. I will, for transparency's sake, I will say that Mitch McConnell, he has 14 slaveholders in his ancestry. So just to complete the picture, there we go. So I want to focus now, friends, on the biblical picture. So when we think about the narrative of the Exodus from Egypt, which, by the way, we're supposed to remember every day and night of our life. We say it in the Kiddush, Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim. We say it in so many of our prayers on the festivals in memory of the redemption from Egypt. But one thing that we might not think about that is integral to the narrative, so much so that it occurs 3 times in the book of Exodus, in the telling of what is to happen when the people leave Egypt. It's also mentioned to Abraham in what is called the covenant of the pieces. So Genesis 15, and God is talking to Abraham about what his descendants will endure, that they will go to a foreign land and they will be enslaved and afflicted, but they will depart b'rechush gadol, with great wealth. And so that they will, that there's some sense of repayment for those years of servitude. But I wanted to just very quickly present these 3 mentions of what I would consider to be reparations. And the first one, it says, I might point out certain things in the Hebrew, but I'm going to do it in the English in the interest of time. So, and I will dispose the Egyptians favorably toward this people, so that when you go, you will not go away empty-handed. This is God speaking to Moses at his prophetic commissioning scene. So this is important, folks. So this is like the first time Moses has an encounter with God at the burning bush. And God says to him, all of these things you're going to do. And this is also important. Each woman shall request from her neighbor and the lodger in her house vessels of silver and gold and clothing. And you shall place them upon your sons and your daughters and despoil the Egyptians. So we learn a couple of things from this, that this is important to Moses's prophetic mission. This is important to the redemptive narrative, that the things that the people are going to take are silver, gold, and clothing, and that who is going to bear them? The sons and daughters, because this is perhaps a symbol of providing generational wealth to a people who are disenfranchised. Let's look at the next one. This is in Exodus 11. So this is Moses telling the people what they're to do. And folks, there are two instructions that he gives them. And this is the first time we really see the people of Israel exercising their agency. So the first thing they're supposed to do is to slaughter the Paschal lamb, which is an act of civil disobedience in Egypt, where the lamb was viewed as a god. And the other thing they're supposed to do is, walk up to their neighbors and say, oh yeah, by the way, I'd like to leave with some silver and gold and finery. And so God says to Moses, I shall bring one more plague upon the people, convey to the people publicly that each man, in this case, it was different above, each woman shall ask his fellow and each woman her contemporary for silver and gold vessels. And in fact, God did as God said. in Exodus 3 disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people. And so then we come to the final occurrence in Exodus 12. So this is actually when they're leaving. And so this is after the smiting of the firstborn of Egypt. And the people of Egypt are rushing out the Israelites, and they're saying, go, please get out of here. Things are not going so well. And the children of Israel do as Moses had conveyed to them. And it says they asked for silver and gold vessels, and Adonai disposed the Egyptians favorably. He gave them grace in the eyes of the Egyptians, really is what it means. Natanet chen ha'am. And they asked them for such things and despoiled Egypt. So folks, I want to be transparent with you. So this root that we're seeing again and again and again with regard to the people are to ask for a gift or to ask for a silver or gold or finery. That root, shin aleph lamed, sometimes does mean to borrow. In fact, the great example is that there's a tradition that in the Mishnah, the women of Jerusalem would go out to the fields and dance in the vineyards, and they would borrow garments from one another so as to not shame those who had none. However, it also means like she'elah, to ask, like a question. And in this case, and I would say, it's problematic to us if we read it as the first. So in other words, if we read it as simply to borrow, like one would borrow a cup of sugar, except we don't actually borrow it and intend to give it back, then there is a real sense of genuineness on behalf of the Israelite people and of God. In other words, it doesn't seem to us as the reader that they plan to return these gifts. So many of our commentators, which I want to present to you now, see this really very strongly as not as a request and asking an act of agency rather than a borrowing. And so I wanted to just share these are a couple of our magnificent Mefarashim, our commentators. And this first one is from Rabbeinu Hananel, who was in what we would now call Tunisia, in Kairoun, and he was the head of the rabbinic academy there. He was one of our greatest Talmudists. And he says the following with regard to, and they asked each man of his fellow and each woman of her contemporary. This is not a request like a request asking to borrow tools, for that is a request on condition of returning it. But God commanded that they, the Israelites, ask the Egyptians for a gift. And again, the Holy One would dispose the Egyptians favorably so that they should give the gifts. And he says, and this is not deceit, heaven forbid, for the Holy Blessed One would command them to do so. Indeed, this thing was permitted to them, for behold, the labor which they did for them, the Egyptians, was so great as to be inestimable. And there is no back wage equivalent to that which is without end or limit. And he says, and this is not is it not Torah law with regard to the indentured servant that one is to laden them with gifts? And that's the passage we looked at just a little bit earlier. And he gives what's called an a fortiori argument, or kal d'chomer, so light and heavy argument. How much more so the Egyptians, for they enjoyed the forced labor, so they weren't even indentured servants; they were slaves for 210 years. So according to at least one commentator, Rabbeinu Hananel, the normative view of this is that the people received a gift, a recompense of reparations upon leaving Egypt. I want to present a couple more of our normative commentators. This is from Rashbam, who is the grandson of Rashi, and I think really one of the pioneers of what I would call Peshat, plain contextual meaning of verses, and also sort of a literary approach. And he says the following. He says, and each woman shall ask of her neighbor for a complete and permanent gift, for behold, and I shall dispose the Egyptians favorably to this people. So he's saying this combination of V'sha'alah and Natan is like ask Sha'ala me, and I shall give you ve'etna, nations as your inheritance. So he's bringing in another verse from scripture that says these two verbs occur associatively in both these cases, and he's using it as a proof text. And he says, and this is the reality of its plain contextual meaning and an answer to the heretics. So in other words, what he's saying is he's talking about this is to dispute those who would say that the Jewish people and that God and Moses were disingenuous and that they were leaving with what they called borrowing and were not intending to return it. So we're seeing a little bit of respectability politics creeping into the commentary of our exegetes. And then finally, here's one other example I'm giving you. It says, "V'nitzal temet Mitzrayim." So, and they stripped or despoiled Egypt as compensation for toiling at crushing labor. So this is Chizikuni, 13th century French rabbi and exegete. So in other words, it seems to be one of the normative views among our commentators that these were a recompense and a sense of certainly at least financial repair that was given to the Israelites upon them leaving slavery. And I wanted to give you one more modern commentator. This is from Moshe Greenberg, one of the greatest modern educators and teachers with regard to the book of Exodus. And he points out what I alluded to earlier. An exquisite touch is the injunction to deck the children with the spoil. The sense is, take enough even to deck out your children, but why mention that? Because the recovery of dignity by the liberated slaves would be signaled, by their being able to provide good things for their children. Of even greater moment than their own enrichment was their capacity to assert parental solicitude toward their children, whom they had been unable heretofore to care for properly or save from cruel oppression.
I'm just looking, I'm listening. I mean, there's.
And folks, I will, if along the way you have a question, I definitely will entertain questions at the end for sure. I wanted to, so that's essentially, and I could go into much greater detail with regard to a textual perspective. For today, this is a taste. I wanted to share, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but these are excerpts from Ta-Nehisi Coates' magisterial article that I mentioned. And this is now we're coming from sort of an American perspective, and we're going to blend them in just a little bit. But I wanted to share a few excerpts from it, and those I've highlighted in black. So what he's doing is putting together sort of a sense of why is it important, according to him, that America give reparations to the descendants of former slaves. Why and what does this say about the soul of America? How does it change, and benefit the receivers and the givers? And he gives a few examples. First of all, he says federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877. The dream of Reconstruction died. For the next century, political violence was visited upon Blacks wantonly, with special treatment meted out toward Black people of ambition. Black schools and churches were burned to the ground. Black voters and political candidates who attempted to rally them were intimidated and some were murdered. At the end of World War I, Black veterans returning to their homes were assaulted for daring to wear the American uniform. The demobilization of soldiers after the war, which put white and Black veterans into competition for scarce jobs, produced the Red Summer of 1919, a succession of racist pogroms against dozens of cities ranging from Longview, Texas, to Chicago to Washington, D.C. Organized white violence against Blacks continued into the 1920s. In 1921, a white mob leveled Tulsa's Black Wall Street, and I would encourage you, friends, to read about that because it is a horrific episode in fairly recent history. And in 1923, right in your neighborhood, another one, actually certainly in Florida, another one razed the Black town of Rosewood, Florida, and virtually no one was punished. However, there have been, I will say that it's an interesting read. They are not calling them reparations, but Rosewood actually is giving in creating and investing in education for the families in the Black community of Rosewood based on this act of violence that was perpetrated in the 1920s. So it's a very concrete and interesting example of reparations. Dad or mom? I can't see who's
Mom.
handed.
So
Hi.
just to add to that, I
Yeah.
read that there are other towns in Florida that also had these pogroms. I'll use the word pogrom. And one was Pahokee, Florida, which is on the way to Lake Okeechobee. And there were other communities around there that also participated in those activities.
Thank you. So it'd be interesting to research and to see, and I encourage you to read it for yourselves, folks. I know that Rosewood has been doing something actually for the past 20 years, and it's very interesting, and it's fairly concrete. So the next thing I want to share with you is he's talking about major reforms in the 1930s that were enacted to combat the Great Depression, like Social Security, like after World War II, of course, the GI Bill. And I think it's important to contextualize it, and I want to do this in a very concrete way. So first of all, when the New Deal was put together, Social Security there was a deal made with Southern Democrats that made it so that 65% of African Americans nationally, between 70 and 80% in the South, were ineligible because they were domestic workers and they were working. Many of them were working in the fields, and so they were a gap and a loophole in Social Security. The other thing is that the GI Bill. So we think that so I can say personally. This is a question I asked myself is, my grandfathers on both sides of the family, my grandfather Conrad served in the Marines, and my other grandfather, Paul, served in the Army Air Corps. Both were able to take advantage of the GI Bill. One of them helped him to train and to open a print business and to buy a house. The other one bought a house and went to get his master's in business administration from Michigan. So both of them were able to build generational wealth through the GI Bill. Now, that's great for us, and I encourage you to do your own research, but what happened is that people of color, Blacks coming back from serving, yes, theoretically, they could use the GI Bill to get a home, but to get a home was very difficult. There were many places that were redlined. They would not be able to live there. The kind of loans they could get were hugely predatory, which continues today in Chicago and other cities. If they wanted to work at a trade and maybe get money for that, maybe they might be able to get it. Yes, they could use the money for college, but how many colleges were admitting Black students at that time? They were basically exclusively Black colleges. So in other words, these two very major reforms that were given on behalf with the idea of equalizing the experience and the wealth of Black Americans were largely not provided to them. And so I think that's important for us to contextualize and to say, did we benefit from these reforms? Yes. Would our lives be different if we hadn't? I know in mine, I can say for sure that it would have been. This is, again, I'm only focused on Friends, on things that I find are really crucial to our taste of this discussion. And so this is the final thing I wanted to bring to you from Coates's article. And this is where he talks about reparations in a more broad perspective, not just as money. And maybe it's not money at all. Maybe it's partially money, maybe it's something else. He says, and so we must imagine a new country. Reparations, by which I mean the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences, is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely. The recovering alcoholic may well have to live with his illness for the rest of his life, but at least he is not living a drunken lie. Reparations beckon us to reject the intoxication of hubris and see America as it is, the work of fallible humans. Won't reparations divide us? Not any more than we are already divided. The wealth gap merely puts a number on something we feel but cannot say. that American prosperity was ill-gotten and selective in its distribution. What is needed is an airing of family secrets, a settling with old ghosts. What is needed is a healing of the American psyche and the banishment of white guilt. What I'm talking about is more than recompense for past injustices, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. Reparations would mean the end of scarfing hot dogs on the 4th of July while denying the facts of our heritage. Reparations would mean the end of yelling patriotism while waving a Confederate flag. Reparations would mean a revolution of the American consciousness, a reconciling of our self-image as the great democratizer with the facts of our history. So it's very interesting, friends, too, is that Ta-Nehisi Coates is, if you've read his other books, is avowedly an atheist. But it's interesting to me that he uses this very spiritual language at the end of this essay, and I think this is really, the kind of very difficult question we have to, we have to look at. Is reparations money that's given? Is it education? Is it investment that really hasn't been given to the Black community? Is it meant simply to give recompense to the descendants of former slaves, or is it meant also to change and to make us better Americans and to give us a real narrative, but also to invest it with new sacred meaning? And that's the answer I would prefer, because I think it's more encompassing. I just wanted to share a quote from my teacher, Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein, and in his article is at the very end of this presentation. I've included a link. It's published on the Medium. As Jews, if we are to take seriously our Torah, our covenant, our faith, our Brit Milah ceremonies, and Passover seders, our Kiddush blessings, and every time we invoke the memory of the Exodus from Egypt, Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. And by the way, friends, all of those places, Brit Milah, Passover Sdarim, Kiddush blessings, all of those are things that, well, certainly the Sdarim, the Seder, in a few places in the Brit Milah reference reparations, and not so much the Kiddush, but it certainly references redemption from Egypt. Then we cannot participate in that fear or engage in that laughter. Without the justice of reparations, we have no liberation story. As Jews, if we take our Torah tradition seriously, we should make it a core issue of Jewish American politics to demand that H.R. 40 be brought to the House floor and passed. We know that liberation from slavery without reparations, is a woefully incomplete liberation. So what he's talking about here, folks, is H.R. 40. So H.R. 40, I'm going to share with you what has happened since I've taken this course last year. And there have been a lot of moves forward with regard to talking about and dealing concretely with reparations. So H.R. 40 was first proposed in, I believe it's in 1989. And it was a bill that was requesting that Congress study reparations with the idea of exploring it and whether Congress and the representatives and the American people really felt that reparations to descendants of former slaves were warranted. It was not a bill that said that reparations would be enacted, but it was simply a proposal to consider this. And from the 1989, when it was first brought to committee, until 2019, it was proposed to bring it into committee and was never brought into the committee, and it was proposed every year. But now some things have changed, and we're going to come to that. I just want to bring that to your attention. We're going to come to that in just a moment. I wanted to give you just a couple other contemporary Jewish perspectives. This is from Rabbi Sharon Bruce, and I've included the video of her riveting High Holy Day sermon called "Our Country Was Built on a Stolen Beam." She says essentially that there's a 2,000-year-old rabbinic dispute, a pluta, between Hillel and Shammai, those great sparring partners in our rabbinic tradition, that what to do if there's a palace or a house that's built on a stolen beam, and that Shammai says that the whole structure must be torn down. But Hillel is pragmatic and says, don't demolish the house. Let the thief pay for the beam that he stole or they stole, considering its full value as the foundation of what is now a beautiful home. So, but neither argues that we can ignore the issue. She asserts essentially that our country was built on a stolen beam, and that the beam were these beings that helped to build this country without their consent. Finally, this is I wanted to share this with you, this is from Politico. This is from just a few months ago in April of 2021. So about HR 41. Wednesday night, the House Judiciary Committee voted to bring HR 40 out of committee. And again, this had not happened since it was first introduced in 1989. You can look that it had, certainly bipartisan support to study it. It's now going to be headed to the House floor. And if passed in both chambers, which may or may not happen, it establishes a commission to study reparations, not to award them, but simply to study them, and then they'll take it from there. So again, I wanted to sort of bring you into where things are now, a little bit of current data. So this is, again, things that have happened since, I took this course about a year ago. So mayors of 11 cities, including Los Angeles, Providence, Austin, Durham, Asheville, Kansas City, Sacramento, St. Paul, Minnesota, and Tallahassee, Oklahoma, and Denver have pledged to award reparations to people of color. And there are many other cities, including Brookline, Massachusetts, where I work, that are considering this. The Detroit City Council voted unanimously to pass a resolution that would place a question regarding reparations for African Americans on voter ballots. These are all things that happened really in the past year. Evanston, Illinois, became the first community to concretely award reparations to people of color and to call them reparations. And I gave you a little bit of the details. $400,000 of that yearly sum is given as a minority business incubator, and $300,000 to pilot a guaranteed income program that provides direct monthly payments to some low-income households, though not specifically to Black families. And that is also an issue, because sometimes the intention of these reforms is to give it to the people who it's intended for, but it doesn't always work that way. It's complicated. Another $100,000 will strengthen the equitable delivery of city services, while the rest will be spread among arts, social service, language access, elderly and immigrant support organizations. And Asheville, North Carolina, is the other community that I know of that is actively engaging in a concrete way. They are using a community reparations model in which they're investing in Black institutions. For your information, you may know this already, as a Reform congregation, at the 2019 URJ biennial, the Reform movement passed a resolution on the study and development of reparations for slavery and systemic racism in the US, becoming the first major Jewish denomination to do so, and immediately began urging Congress to take action to this end. So it is certainly from the Conference of Reform Judaism, what I would say is a quote unquote, not maybe the normative stance, but a normative stance. As I mentioned earlier, Sharon Bruce and Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein are very active conservative rabbis who have penned these penetrating articles. But I want to address one more question or one more thought, and then I want to take questions. So we're coming to the High Holy Days, and I don't want to get us there before it's time, but that's a stressful time for, I can certainly say rabbis and cantors, and but maybe for others too. But I wanted to, wrestle with this question. You might say to me, Cantor Michael, and you might not even agree with this, but you might say, yeah, it seems to me like biblical sources point and some of our sources point to the fact that our ancestors took reparations when they departed Egypt. And then you might say to me, but that was many, many years ago. This is this mythic story in our consciousness. But I wasn't there. My ancestors may have come over and, after slavery, and they, and so is this really my issue? And there are many different ways to approach this, but I wanted to approach it with a mind to the high holy days. So in one of the, and this actually came in the Middle Ages, this textual variant that has been reinserted into the conservative Machzor. I don't think it's in the Reform most current Machzor, but I wanted to. There's this phrase at the end of the Vidui that precedes, or actually I should say the beginning of the Vidui, right before Ashamnu, and it says, "Avala nachnu va'avotenu chatanu." The righteous ones, and we have not sinned. Is what it says before this, but then it says, but really, indeed, we and our ancestors have sinned.
Hi, Benjamin.
I am going to ask that if you're talking on the phone, so glad to have you. Please do mute your audio. So there's an idea, and you might say to me, Cantor Michael, I thought that Judaism taught that we're only responsible for what our generation does or what we do, and I would say that you are partially right. Let me just see if I can. I don't know if I could do that because I'm not the host, I think. But so the next thing it says, this is from Leviticus, and the verse says, "And those of you left shall decay through their iniquity in the land of your enemies. Moreover, they shall rot through the iniquities of their ancestors that are with them. And they shall confess their sins, the sins of their ancestors, that they, the ancestors, acted treacherously." And so we have this wonderful comment that says the following: "And those of you left shall fester or rot through their iniquity." And it says, the verse doesn't say only yimaku, rot, but rot ba'avonam, rot through their sins. So, and then it continues, "Moreover, they shall rot through the iniquities of their ancestors that are with them." And didn't the Holy One already assure that Israel that the judgment against the ancestors is not through the children? And vice versa, as it is stated, "The father shall not be put to death on account of the children, and the children shall not be put to death on account of the fathers." So it's raising a real good challenge to it and saying, I thought we're only responsible for what we do, not our ancestors. And what is the resolution? The resolution, or the teirutz, is you're right. However, when we take hold of the sins of our ancestors and refuse to deal with them generation after generation, then we are judged for them. And then we have to say, "Aval anachnu ve'avotenu chatanu." We and our ancestors have sinned. In fact, this a very similar passage in the Talmud that uses the same verse, or a slightly different verse. They talk about the same issue, and they say, what's the deal? We're not responsible when we didn't actually commit the sin. And what if the community is doing something that's wrong, and we didn't partake of it? Are we responsible? And the Talmud says, yes, when you had the power to protest and you didn't do so. So that is my answer, or my question to you is, are we responsible? For me, I think there is responsibility, because I think we have not put down insipid racism. We can say, yes, you can say to me, Cantor Michael, those, white supremacists, yes, that's racism. But there is a very large spectrum, folks. And I think, we have to think about, we're not just talking about the major people who are aggressively talking about, speaking about hurting other people. There's a whole scale of microaggressions and subtle cues that are built into the fabric of this country. So I will say, and I'm very happy to take questions, I do want to just point out to you briefly that I've included links to a number of resources for you, including the Case for Reparations, the Torah Case for Reparations. There's a wonderful book from a Christian perspective, because this is a hot topic in the churches, a Christian call for repentance and repair, that I found very useful to sort of see how the Christian church is going about it. There's a wonderful podcast. It's the golden age of Jewish podcasts. It's called Silver and Gold, Reparations in Judaism. There's an article from Moment Magazine that said, should Jews support reparations for African Americans, with a representative from basically every different stream of Judaism. So with that, I'm going to stop the share. And I know I ran over in terms of my talking, but I'm very happy to entertain questions, comments, thoughts. It looks like Fran, and I think Charles, did you have a comment too? It looked like you might have been raising. No.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, go for it.
Okay, there's an article in the current New Yorker magazine written by Nicholas Lehman about diversity verdict. And the point of his article is that higher education, especially elite higher education, has basically been closed to Blacks. And since the 60s, we have had affirmative action, which is now coming under scrutiny by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has issued or reviewed 5 or 6 cases, and their verdicts are totally confusing, so that the schools are drifting. They're trying to equate diversity, equity, and inclusion. One seems to contradict the other. And I know it's not a particularly Jewish issue, but since Jews have in the past kind of dominated higher education, it does kind of reflect on our view. White America is still closed to that ticket to success, that degree from Harvard or Yale. Very, very difficult. They've tried all different methods. None of them seem to work. So I don't know what reparations will do that the universities are not able to do.
That's a great point, Fran. It's interesting, right? Because when we're talking about diversity is hugely important. But equity we're assuming that everybody is coming, or I think one of the issues is that people are assuming, well, we all came from an equal standpoint. Well, that's not the case. Even if you said that, okay, so the slaves were freed, and they were allowed to go free, or they were given 40 acres and a mule. Well, in some cases that was the case, but most of the time they were lynched, they were taken from them. So in other words, we're not coming from an equal standpoint in terms of generational wealth and opportunity. It is a big issue you're bringing to the forefront. So thanks for adding nuance to our conversation. So that is, I know that my wife is at MIT, and I know that's something they're working very assiduously with regard to first generation college students. It's a very difficult but worthwhile endeavor to be a part of. Thanks so much. I want to turn to I saw Barry, and I think you were waiting patiently, and then I think Paula. Barry, did you have I thought I saw your hand raised, but I could be wrong.
You did see mine, but go ahead.
No, I just wanted to, because I thought I saw his before, but maybe not.
Okay.
Okay,
my
Paula,
question is more pragmatic, I think.
Sure.
I can accept a case for reparations, but my fear is that its implementation would be divisive.
Yeah.
That the history of the world is ugly. Mm-hmm. Everybody has been sinned against if one looks. I mean, the Jews certainly have been. Many different populations. Look what the Ottoman Empire did. I mean, world history is ugly. Yes. So if you start saying United States will pay reparations to the Black community, we get into what is a Black person, which we know from Germany can get very ugly very quickly. Yeah. We look at what's happened to the Native American communities and what the rule, is it still 1/16 makes you Black, makes you Indian? I don't know, excuse me, Native American. So I'm wondering, A, what your solution might be, Michael, and B, is it not a more equitable approach to look at people in need, which might include Appalachian whites who have no Black blood but are certainly in need, and 29 other immigrant communities and whatsoever, instead of focusing in on Blacks?
It's a great question and challenge. So a couple things I'll regular. I have thought about this a lot. So, first of all, I think one issue, one case of reparations that the country was severely divided about whether to take them or not was with regard to Israel and Germany. And Menachem Begin and others were violently opposed to it and said, there's nothing that they can do that will make this, that will provide atonement. But, I have to, there are a few things, I think it's, so I think it would be divisive. Does that mean that it's not morally the right thing to do? I don't necessarily think so. What form it will take, I'm not an expert in that realm. My expertise is limited to Jewish sources. But I think that, so in other words, I think that just because something is unpopular doesn't mean there's a reason not to do it. And I think Judaism would push back at us and say, that God, this is so important that it was on God's agenda. But here's another difference too, is that we actually still, unlike the Israelite slaves, our former slaves are, I shouldn't say all of them, but I think most of them are still living in this country. We have the opportunity to make this better. And I agree with you, there are other indigenous groups that are deserving of this. One of the really, I think the only example from American history where the concrete way that this has happened from the national government is with Japanese Americans who were interned in camps during World War II, and reparations were awarded twice. So in other words, I think you're right, it is complex. There are others who are deserving. I would prefer not to walk away from the issue because of those obstacles, but thank you for bringing the complexity to discussion. So
if I may only make one other
Yes.
comment, and that is, I've always been taught your responsibility on raising a problem is to also provide a solution.
Yes.
And I would look to Reform Judaism as an institution to help us look for that, please.
Yes. So
Not
I would
that
say,
I mean to shovel it at you.
No. I think you're right. And so what I would stay attuned to what, and I would, Jonah Pesner is someone who I know personally who does this kind of work for the reform movement. I did a lot of work with him when he was in Boston. He would have very concrete, I think they are starting to get into the point. They want to create buy-in first, and I think they want to address this in a more concrete way. And I think you're going to see synagogues like Northampton doing that. But you absolutely turn to your wonderful movement, which is very thoughtful, I think, as is my own. I want to turn. So I know that the Oblers, I think, had a thought, and I know the rabbi and also Gusty. So please, the Oblers.
Well, I just, I was thinking about the Mitch McConnell comment, and I wonder if that's because he doesn't have the background to be sympathetic, or whether he's just taking the Florida approach, which is put your head in the sand. Here in Florida, it's not allowed to teach anything regarding the time of slavery or anything that would be at all negative to a white male culture is not allowed to be taught here. So my question is, before we start talking about reparations, which I do support, should we be talking about education and program of explaining why? Not that you're going to change anybody's mind, you're not going to, but at least it gives them a chance to give their point of view, and you have your point of view. And then when you move on to reparations, perhaps there's a better base. Yeah,
I think that's a great, so first of all, I would say for me, if and another session, what I might explore with you is, what does Judaism say? What are some potential ways to address this? Education would be a primary part of a reparations process. So it's a multi-pronged process that involves education. I think that is, I think it's also easy. In Mitch McConnell's case, I don't know. I mean, I think that there personally he is burying his head in the sand. However, there are so many issues that are of import, and I think Paula raised that. What about poor whites in Appalachia? What about the environment? There's so many. But I would also say that reparations and racism and classism, they all intersect. Environmentalism, whatever, these things often intersect with one another. So by wrestling with the one head of the snake, we're sort of we're actually addressing some other concerns as well. But I think education has to be a place, and I do think that sometimes people change their minds when they're more informed. So I not always, and that's okay too. But I think it's to make an informed choice. Thank you so much. I want to turn to the rabbi, and then I saw that Gusty, and I know my dad had a thought too. So, but I'm trying as best as I can to go in the order I saw. Rabbi Herman, hi.
Hi. Wonderful presentation. Very well done.
So nice to be with you.
And I don't have a question. Just a couple of comments.
Sure.
One is, in Judaism we constantly talk about tikkun. Tikkun means to repair. And one of the things that we try and do is we try and repair injustices that have taken place in the past, whether from descendants or from others. So I think in the value of tikkun or repair plays itself out in reparations. The other thing I wanted to make clear was that, this is not the first time in history that reparations would have been paid in some way, shape, manner, or form. I mean, Germany still pays reparations to Holocaust survivors and to Israel. The United States paid reparations to the Japanese in the internment camp, from the internment camps. So this is not a precedent that we're sitting on, and for us to just bury our heads in the sand or turn away, and even though there are other issues that are important and need funding or need attention, it doesn't mean that this issue is any less important or demanding and requires our attention as well. That was all I wanted to.
Thank you. I that's a beautiful way of framing it in terms of Jewish values. Thanks. And I'd also point you to when Sharon Bruce spoke on Rosh Hashanah about reparations. That was when you look at her sermon. There is a pastor who speaks too, and he has restarted the Poor People's Campaign, Martin Luther King Jr. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but it's a wonderful organization, and they are carrying through that mission essentially of working for those who are disenfranchised, regardless of color or identity, and with the hope that will improve the life for everyone. So speaking to what you were raising, Paula. So I'm turning now to Gus.
I'm wondering about the human infrastructure bill and to what extent this addresses the issues that you're raising. In the Poor People's Campaign, that reverend keeps saying there are more poor white people than there are poor Black people. So it seems to me that raising the bottom, whoever is at the bottom in terms of economics or education or opportunity, it is less divisive, going back to what Paula was saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different ways to approach it. I mean, I think that is, I think his way is to create a lot of buy-in, and I think it is in a sense of unity. I think we can do both. I think the reality on the ground is that many of these reforms that are enacted by communities, the resources will be allocated by default to whites. And that happens a lot, but I think that I think as Jews who have a tradition that speaks about reparations, and I'd encourage you at at Passover to really, to have this conversation. And I've created a Seder insert for anyone who's interested in it. I think our narrative does speak clearly to this, and it's something we speak about equity for the refugee, the orphan, the widow, but we're also, I think our tradition also teaches about reparations for former slaves. So I think both are worthwhile endeavors, and you won't go wrong either way. Good. I want to turn to my dad. I think you had a question.
Well, actually, I had an observation more than a question. In terms of those who would say that, well, what's the big deal? The blacks were set free. I would just point out that whereas the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, I believe, on January 1st, 1863, we know from Juneteenth, which is now a national holiday, that the black slaves in Texas didn't even know they were free until June 19th, 1865, 2 months after Appomattox took place.
Right.
Secondly, I think we have to look at this not so much individually, but instead collectively. We say, well, what's my responsibility? Well, collectively, societally, we have a responsibility. And in terms of whether it's for whites or blacks, I would just point out that, like the Jews in Europe, Germany, during the before World War II, and then through the end of the war, were subjected to the Nuremberg laws and systemic marginalization and then annihilation. The blacks in America were enslaved in one way or another for 400 years. And racism was institutionalized and was systemic. And I don't think we can compare the black experience to anything other than perhaps the Native American experience. Because the rest of us, when we go out of the door at night during the day, we're white. When you go out of the door and you're black, you're carrying a badge with you that marks you everywhere you go.
Yeah, I wanted, and I'm coming to you, Irene, I promise. Thank you for waiting so patiently. Yeah, I mean, I think it is, and it gets a little murky, as someone who is, from a Jewish perspective, because I think, we were for a long time in this country not considered white. We wanted to be considered white. We are considered white, but yet we're not. But yet we are experiencing anti-Semitism, and it's complicated. However, it's, as you said, that, and again, but I'm also, what if I'm a Jew of color? That's a very growing and an important community. But if I, Michael McCloskey, walk out of the house, I mean, someone might say you look kind of Jewish, but maybe not, probably not. But it probably won't have an impact on my abilities to succeed. So, in other words, this is something that is nuanced, and I think, I think thanks for bringing that up. I mean, what you said is powerful. I don't have anything, I can't add anything to it. Irene, I think you've been waiting very patiently.
That's quite all right. I really thought that your presentation was very, very good. And I have a question about the early aspect of it. But before I ask that question, going back in a sense to what Paula mentioned and also what Steve has just referred to, there's been a division, I think, even among the Black community between those who are descendants of slavery and those who have come to this country later than that period, the immigrants later, and where they fit into this question of reparations. Do people, I mean, as Steve says, a Black person walks out the door, he's Black. whether or not he is a descendant of slaves or whether he is a more recent immigrant. He too is experiencing a great degree of discrimination. So what my question in a sense is, in the reparations bills and in the reparation discussions, is it addressing just those who are descendants of slaves, or is it addressing those newer comers to our shores?
Great question. So as far as I think the question that's going to hopefully be before Congress is really to investigate the concept of reparations for. I think it's a little bit of both. We're descendants of slaves, but also for Black America. And I think to create a greater sense of generational wealth and equity. I think so. I think it is that. You had such a great question. I had something else that I wanted to respond to too, but it's eluding me. You're drawing so many good things in my head. I may come back to it, Irene, but I think it's complex.
Because I think that there are a number of those who are direct descendants,
yes,
who are would be very unhappy that whatever reparations they receive might be smaller or not compensated to the degree that they should be, because it might be diluted by those who are not the descendants. So I think I think it has the question has even created a problem among the Black, within the Black community, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think part of it is going to be the hope is that it's with regard to individuals. Part of it is with regard to education for all Americans. Part of it is I think part of it will be institutionally. For example, I know in Evanston they're working to provide help to those who were victims of predatory loans, and that's a consideration too, because it was such a big problem, and it is still in Chicago. So I think the other thing we haven't really talked about is cultural theft, and that extends to indigenous peoples too. But not just did we steal people and break families apart. America also, there's cultural robbery of people, and we decimated culture. So that's something we Jews can understand.
Okay. There's one other question I had, and that's where go back to the text that you began the whole discussion with, which was very interesting. And you referred, the text refers several times to the Israelites despoiling Egypt as they left, and even then commentators, used that term, despoiling Egypt, as a way of reparation. And what does that mean?
Great question. Yeah, so Venit Saltem is it's the same root actually. It's a different form of it, but it's to take this root generally means to take something from one place and to bring it to another. Like lehatziel is to redeem someone, but it's to bring them from one place to another. And in this case, the spoil it meant essentially that they left with a lot of booty. So in other words, they left with a lot of wealth. And again, it's viewed as something that it was compensation for hundreds of years of slavery. I think it is done now in the Bible. It's done in a fairly haphazard way. In other words, at the last minute. But as Americans, we don't have to do it that way. I mean, we could do it with bipartisan support, and we could do it in a way that is thoughtful and is really, we've waited this long, we might as well do it right. So that's a great point. And so that's what Venit Saltem means. I want to turn to, I know Fran, remind me,
Michael.
Oh, Michael, thank you. Easy to remember. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for your patience with me.
Thank you. I find that there's a huge dichotomy in this country between what seems to be a moving forward to grant reparations of some sort in Congress, perhaps in the mind of many people, perhaps clearer thinking people. But that goes up against what's happening in so many states where the very people who would be deserving of reparation, and as you said, it doesn't have to be just Black people, it could be other people who've been wronged over the year, because almost every culture has had to pay its dues, coming here as immigrants, being the dregs of society for a while, and then after a while assimilating, integrating, intermarrying, and becoming respected, even though they may be confined to some jobs, but they migrate to those naturally. But what's happening in so many states is that these very people being disenfranchised, the very people that the reparations would support are being disenfranchised.
Again.
Again, they're being discriminated against willfully, purposefully by legislators who are trying to make it difficult or impossible for them to participate in our democracy. So where do you square that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, I compare it, this is a horrifying analogy, but really it's like, it's the case of Black Americans, I think is different because these other groups, I think, were, they experienced, being the dregs and to a certain degree, but at a certain point where, people stopped kicking them down or us down. But I would compare it to someone, who's really like working hard and is trying to get up, and yet you kick them down again, and you chop off the arm, and then you chop off the leg, and it just happens again and again and again. Whether it's lives, whether it's feeling unsafe, whether it's microaggressions, whether it's a lack of equity in terms of resources, it is just it is systemic. So and you're right, that is it's like where do we turn? It is overwhelming because the injustice is coming from many different angles. I recognize that. Thank you.
The reparations, are we talking about cash, housing? What is a reparation be?
I think in different cases, as we've seen it from the few really concrete places that are doing it, it can be supplement, it can be helping with housing, it can be helping with education, it can be investing in Black organizations in the community. I think that my personal feeling is the more concrete it is, and I think the more that it's done institutional way to sort of make sure that the more people can take advantage of it is probably better. I know that Rob, you were waiting patiently. Thank you. Thanks so much, Fran.
To get unmuted. Thank you. I want to follow up and say something similar to what Michael said, something that bothers me and why education is just so important. Mm-hmm. Obviously can't go into schools and teach it, but when we have the opportunity in a non-confrontational way, I think it's important for us to educate people. Mm-hmm. What is going on right now in the United States is the third phase of new Jim Crow laws.
Right.
And I think people don't understand, the Jim Crow laws after the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And recently, I think it was 10 or 15 years ago, there was a book written called The New Jim Crow Laws.
Excellent.
About, you probably know it, which really dealt with incarceration and minorities being put in. But what is going on right now in the United States of America is the third set of Jim Crow laws by legislators depriving people to vote. And that is something we can take an active role in, because as Michael said, if you can't vote, you can't do anything. And I think it's very important that we educate ourselves as to what's going on. And when we get the opportunity, explain to people why these new legislative laws in a lot of states really disenfranchise people, because candidly, they're not going to be overturned. sorry for that comment. They're going to be in place for the 2024 election. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think that what can you do? Yeah, I mean, I think you can pray with your feet, as Abraham Joshua Heschel said, and to educate. And I would say if you find that there are different ways to approach this, the path of organizing, the path of education. For me, I believe strongly in this topic, and so for me, it's important to. I feel like I have a mandate as a cantor, as someone who prays these words, who reads the scripture, and who holds these values to teach about it. And I think to enter these conversations are important. And I think a really good way to start is look at again, bring out the GI Bill. It's a really concrete way of looking at at a generator of intergenerational wealth that that we may have been able to take advantage of. But yes, the voting is key. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? I'm always happy to if you have a question or you. I would be happy to share resources with you. Again, just wanted to remind people that in the chat there is a document that you can click on. It has all the resources, including the links that I shared with you today. If for some reason, I know Paula, we weren't able to access it, just drop me an email or to my dad, and I'll make sure to email you a copy if that's a problem. And I really appreciate you reaching out.
Is Dick able to put it in the e-blast, the NJC News?
I'll leave that up to whatever they think. So, Dick, I think you're on.
Dick, you're on mute.
We certainly can. Michael, send me the links that you're referring to.
I'm happy to.
I'll make up a little blurb for anybody who might be interested. Sure.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Oh, sorry. Yeah, please.
We all believe in education as a thing, but when you look at the education about the vaccine, it's very discouraging what the limits of education.
Yes, that is it's an issue in itself that is meriting a lot of discussion. I'm going to limit my focus today to this, but yes, it is disheartening, Gusty. Thank you. Yes, please, Rob.
Oh, I just wanted to say this was so interesting and so informative. And it's a lot to take in and think about. And I wanted to thank you.
Thank you. And I hope that the conversations continue. If you are interested, I have on Vimeo Live a number of things that I've taught about. I taught really a 4 or 5 session course on this. Again, the podcast with Aria Bernstein is wonderful from a Jewish perspective, but there are many great resources. Thank you so much. And I hope that you have a wonderful and productive afternoon and that everybody stays well.